Hello, everyone. We are still in chapter two, and I believe part four. Um, we were doing chapter two, the PowerPoint, and then after about three slides, we launch off and go into this Word document handout. Let me share it with you. And that's what we have been going through before we get to the remaining section of the PowerPoint on chapter two. Oh, let's see here. All right, so the last section in this master strategy tools stuff is it talks a little bit about mergers and acquisitions, but it it as much gets into understanding fundamentally this whole strategy and finance and business strategy and putting all this together because it doesn't matter if it's internal to the company and trying to start a new product line or start a new avenue of business from scratch, or a company going out and buying maybe a competitor or an operation that's already been running, which is a merger or acquisition. All of these fundamentally follow the same, I don't know, the same, they follow the same tools or they follow the same process when you're going through it. So this is extremely important. In fact, I would say this chapter two, this document is something you are going to want to read through on your own again, in part because you need to understand this because you won't be able to complete your projects for this class unless you have a fundamental idea of what it is we're actually trying to do. Before we get there, oh, and my wife and kids are at home today, so there's a lot of clanking and banging. That's okay. They know not to bother me, but I am going to go put a sign up quick that tells them I'm actually recording. All right, let's get into it. So, again, in this section, we're going to talk about mergers and acquisitions. The reason we're doing this is because a lot like the Ansoff matrix, when a company has to figure out how it's going to grow, when it's looking at different options, it the company's going to pay attention to the level of risk that's associated with it. When we think about risk in business and in finance and in business twice there, you're looking at the ability to predict. So if you imagine a graph or a diagram, I don't have a, if you look up in the top right hand corner of your screen, if you have a diagram, let's say a graph that's going up as my hand is going up, okay, and you were to have two, you're trying to predict what's going to happen next, it's fairly easy with linear regression to just draw a straight line over to, whatever the growth is or whatever's happening there. So when we try to measure risk in finance, you're measuring the ability to predict what's going to happen next. So if you have a line that's going, yeah, I'm just going to draw it. Okay, so you have two lines there. One of them's a straight line. If you were trying to predict what was going to happen next on that straight line, again, it would be very easy. You would just draw a line from there. But the curvy one, if you're trying to predict what's going to happen next, you have a deviation, a standard deviation. The higher that is, the less likely you're going to be able to predict what's going to happen next. That is risk. The more that fluctuates, the higher the risk because of the inability to predict what's going to happen next. So, when we talk about mergers and acquisitions, when we talk about growth, we're trying to figure out whether or not this is worthwhile. When we look at that, we're looking at that level of risk. That level of risk also, the part to play in it is knowledge. Okay. Business is knowledge. It's what do you know how to do? How do you know how to do it? Do you do it well? Do you not do it very well? Does anybody else do it well? Or, how does that work? So one of the options businesses have, if they don't possess some of the knowledge, is maybe they'll go acquire a company that does have the knowledge of how to do that. And they're willing to pay a premium based on that. So what the company A, let's say, or let's say we have a parent firm, which think about the parent firm being large, okay? It's a big company, has $1 billion in revenue every year, and they're going to go after a company, a target firm or a target business that manufactures a component for the parent company, and the parent company wants to start doing that in-house. So one of their options might be to go buy that company, okay, in order to get that. Now, there's some key facets in here. One of the issues that happens in mergers and acquisitions, it's something like, 60 or 70% of them fail to create value. There we go. 50 to 80% of mergers and acquisitions fail to create value for the firm. What that means is when you add up the sort of advantage of possessing this company, and we look at the difference between the cost that it takes to buy said firm, if we add that on top of to the value of the current firm, if it doesn't create value, what it's saying is that if you were to add up the parent firm plus the target firm and then equal it out, it should be, let's say, $1.2 billion dollars. So the parent firm's 1 billion, the target firm is 200 million. So when you add those up, it should be 1.2 billion. Now, if you add both of those up and it is less than 1.2 billion, then from a financial standpoint, you shouldn't buy that firm because there's no advantage, there's no additional value that's created. We actually call that synergy, but there's no added value in taking that company over. It looks like its value is far higher left alone, and there's no then advantage. Now, there might be other advantages for the parent firm when taking over the target firm, but let's just say when they're trying to acquire it, if they can't take the parent plus the target and equal it higher than they are separate, then you shouldn't go through with the merger acquisition. So, in about 50 to 80% of the time, mergers and acquisitions seem to fail to create that added value. So, this next section, we're going to get into this. And in order to do this, we do have to get back into some financial ideas. So, what we're going to do, this is one I drew up many years ago. I don't think Poet's CFO is still Dan Loveland. Who knows? Poet is the company, publicly traded company that manufactures ethanol. Okay. Over here we have Warren Buffett, who is a great friend of mine. No, he's not, but we're going to pretend he is. So Warren Buffett contacted me a few years ago and said, Bruce, I'd like to start a private equity firm with you where we go and invest in other companies. And I thought, Warren, that's a great idea. Let's do it. So we start a company and we are trying to go out and based on a level of risk, we're trying to get investments that, I don't know, have a rate of return that's above 12% because maybe we can't get better returns anywhere else. So we're shooting for above 12%. So Warren Buffett and I have agreed that our required rate of return is 12%. So Dan Loveland, CFO of Poet, gives us a call. He needs a little bit of money. They're trying to start a new venture. We'll call it algae biofuel. So they're trying to make alcohol out of algae, and there's a plethora of algae on planet Earth. So Dan talks to us and he says, based on that information, or based on everything we're looking at so far, based on historically what we've been able to do with grain, taking into account the learning curve in doing all this in the financials, we expect to have a rate of return above 16% for this venture. Okay. So Warren and Mai's required rate of return is 12%. So the difference between the rate of return of the project and our required rate of return is about 4. Okay. So we would have what's called economic value added of about 4%. Okay, because we're going to earn 16, we have to have a required rate of return of a minimum of 12. So the economic value added in this case would be that 4%. So this is where students often get very frustrated because we have these different terms and they're kind of the same thing. It's like the two sides to the coin. Now, once Warren and I invest this money, and Dan Loveland takes our money, let's say $10 million, to go try this venture. Then Dan Loveland has to have a cost of capital. Okay. So he has to make sure he is delivering a rate of return back to Warren and I at what he said. So his cost of capital is Warren and I's required rate of return. Okay. So his cost of capital at minimum would be 12% because if Warren and I can't get at least 12%, then we're going to pull out our money or try to get our money back and we're going to go put it somewhere where we can get that. So Warren and I's required rate of return is poet Dan Loveland's cost of capital. He has to he has to provide that. So if Dan, he right now he thinks he's going to earn about a 16% rate of return or IRR on this project. Again, Warren and I need 12%. Then we would have the economic value added of 4%. Now, what happens if Dan finds he's only able to deliver 9% as a rate of return on this new algae biofuel product? Well, then we would have an economic loss. Okay. So when it's above the required rate of return, it's economic value added. If what it turns into is less than that, then it's an economic loss. And then Warren and I would lose, Dan Loveland would lose because we're going to pull out our money and we're going to go elsewhere. So that internal rate of return, okay, or cost of capital and required rate of return are kind of the same thing. Dan has to provide X amount. Now, the reason we say this and we talk about this is because Dan actually doesn't pay back. Um, he's not going to pay Warren and I unless we stipulate it in a contract. He's not actually going to pay anything to Warren and I. Instead, what's going to happen is our money gets turned into some form of stock, either preferred or common stock of Poet, and then it should appreciate over time as this venture grows and gets better and better, and we do the product life cycle and we go, that's what should happen. And then at some point, if we look at our $10 million and let's say we invest it for 5 years, if we have a required rate of return of 12%, then you would do a valuation, a discounting cash flows to figure out, okay, in 5 years, what is a rate of return of 12% on $10 million? Um, so that's what we're looking at. So again, what I want you to remember is Warren and Mai's required rate of return turns into Dan Loveland and Poet's cost of capital because they have to provide that. Now, when Dan Loveland goes and does a project like that, he doesn't just have stock or as a form of capital, he doesn't just have common stock or preferred stock. He can also go to the bank and borrow money. So when he goes to the bank and borrows money, let's say Dan needs $10 million. So he borrows 5 million from Warren and I. We're going to say he expects to receive the rate of return of or the rate of return on his algae biofuel project of 16%. He knows he has to return the 12% to Warren and I. Um, and pay us back in 5 years. But Dan also can borrow money. So we're going to say that Dan has to pay Warren and I 12%. He goes to the bank, he's going to borrow the other 5 million. He has to pay then, we'll say 6% to the bank. Okay. So 50% of the investment is debt, 50% of the investment is equity. So when then we multiply that by the required rate of return of both entities. So if 50% is, tell you what, why don't we hit pause here and I'm going to write this out because I think you're going to get confused otherwise. Okay, I think I got this. Normally I would write this on a whiteboard, so my apologies. Okay, so again, Dan Loveland from Poet, he's their CFO or was. So if Dan wants to do this algae biofuel idea, okay, let's say he needs $10 million to get this started or to get it running and to start selling algae biofuel because they got to buy a bunch of equipment, maybe a new facility, something like that. So Dan contacts First Bank and Trust and Bruce and Warren Capital to get some money. The bank usually isn't going to loan money more than what can be collateralized in a situation like that. So, land, property, plant, equipment, those types of things, a bank will allow a company to borrow money for. Now, if you're talking like General Electric, a mega conglomerate that's been in business forever, banks are a lot more willing to loan money. In fact, they want to lend money because the controls are often a lot tighter in there and well, there's 100 other reasons, but when you're talking even mid-size, small-size manufacturing facilities, it is not uncommon for a bank to say, if we're going to loan you money, we're going to make sure it's collateralized. Okay, so Dan needs $10 million. So he gets $5 million for BW Capital. That's Bruce and Warren Capital. And Dan can get $5 million from First Bank and Trust. Okay. Warren and I have a required rate of return of 12%. First Bank and Trust has a required rate of return. Their interest rate they're going to charge is 6%. So the 10 million, you would not set a cost of capital at 12 because when you borrow money from the bank, it's actually cheaper. And this is where a lot of young people, students, don't understand. It is actually preferable for a company to borrow money from a bank to get its source of capital because it's cheaper. In fact, that's it overwhelmingly, that would be the preference. The problem is if something goes haywire and the project's not going to work or it's not going to be feasible, then Poet is still on the hook to pay back the bank. If it's Warren and I, Poet can just say, look, sorry, we're not going to pay you. Um, and then Warren and I contact an attorney and try to file a lawsuit and try to get our money back, in which time, let's say Poet starts crashing. And now they become insolvent and they're over leveraged and they have to pay the bank back. So debt gets paid back first in bankruptcy. And that's why, from the standpoint of equity and debt, the debt holders get charged a little less than the equity holders, is because they get first dibs in bankruptcy. So the risk is less than it would be for Warren and I. So that's you need to fundamentally understand that because that phenomenon is it's a rule in finance, it's a rule in business. So you can't be making decisions without understanding that rule and its impact. Again, when I saw a presentation 2 years ago with students, um, giving those I think it was BADM 45, they were giving presentations, and I noticed almost all of them recommended decreasing debt. And I looked at all of them and I said, what are you guys doing? That's you're not understanding this. Debt is preferable for a company because it has a lower cost of capital. And Dan Loveland's goal is to constantly try to decrease the cost of capital. Okay. Okay, so Dan needs $10 million. He gets 5 million from Warren and I, and then 5 million from First Bank and Trust. So what we need to figure out, or what Dan needs to figure out, is what is the weighted average cost of capital that he has to provide in order to pay back both of those those capital holders. Okay. So in order to figure that out, you take 12% from BW Capital that's required and you multiply that by 50%. Why? Because our share is 50% of the total investment for this algae biofuel product. Then we look at First Bank and Trust, and they have 5 million, which is 50%. So Dan's going to own them 6%. So to figure out a weighted average cost of capital, we multiply the interest or the required rate of return times that percentage, and then that gives us that number. Then we add the 6% plus the 3%. So this is, guys, this is easy. This is just a weighted average cost of capital. So then we add 6% plus 3%, and you notice we get 9% is a weighted average cost of capital. When it's 9%, is that less than 12%? Yes. So it's advantageous for Dan Loveland to borrow money because it lowers his cost of capital. And that gets into some huge financial impacts. One of them is, well, then if we should borrow all the money because it's cheaper, why don't all companies do that? One of the reasons is because banks won't do that. Because I told you they're not going to loan money if it's not collateralized, um, except in huge conglomerate circumstances. Um, but most of the time they're not going to loan out the money. The other problem you run into is from a financial standpoint, with the debt, you have to pay back periodic payments plus interest. So it's not something you can wait on. There are such things as balloon payments, but oftentimes for companies, the bank wants to get paid sooner rather than later. And actually all investors and capital holders want to get paid sooner rather than later. Okay, so Dan needs to provide a 9% rate of return, okay, to the bank and to Warren when we multiply it times the percentage of capital that we've invested in this. So the weighted average cost of capital is how we determine that amount. So the cost of capital for Dan Loveland or Poet is 9%. He has to provide that rate of return. Now, when Dan goes and does this, what you're contrasting and comparing is, well, how much do we have to provide back to the stockholders in the bank? And then on the other side of this, Dan will have his finance managers and engineers and executives and managers when they come to try to propose a new product line, they do what's called a capital budget. When they do that, there's a few different approaches you use. One of them is called net present value, and the other that's more commonly used is IRR or internal rate of return. Or way more commonly that most companies use now is called the modified internal rate of return. Now, when they do that, here's what they're looking at. It's the same thing as a stock valuation or a private business valuation. They're trying to figure out how much of a rate of return does this need to provide? So the algae biofuel to cover the weighted average cost of capital. That's what they're trying to figure out inside a poet. If they can provide that rate of return that's higher than the cost of capital, well, then they should go through with it. And one of the fundamental arguments in finance is actually, as long as a company, let's say in a perfect world, they know they're going to be successful at everything, as long as they have a higher rate of return on that product line or that investment or that acquisition, as long as it's always higher than the cost of capital, then Dan Loveland and Poet should keep trying to go external to get more money to grow and to grow and to grow and to grow and to grow. Okay. Because they're always able to provide that rate of return. Now, the reality is there's so many complexities and what ifs, and we don't know the likelihood of that materializing, which then causes issues from the standpoint of the capital investors, the debt holders, and the stockholders. Okay, so here's what you need to know. So up here, we calculated a weighted average cost of capital. So the terminology required rate of return is from the standpoint of the principals. So for Warren and I, our required rate of return was 12. From First Bank and Trust, their required rate of return was 6%. Okay. Those are our required rate of return. Now, when we flip the coin from the standpoint of Poet, our required rate of return just turned into their cost of capital. They need to have the capacity to pay that. Now they figure that out by using what's called the weighted average cost of capital. So in the story I just told you about Dan Loveland and his finance managers and engineers and plant managers that are trying to propose new ways to grow the company, what Dan will do just to make things easier for them, he instead of giving them their weighted average cost of capital, which is there's no like cushion in that, Dan is going to add a little bit, a percent or two or three or four or whatever it is. He's going to add some cushion in there. And then that weighted average cost of capital plus that cushion is going to be called the hurdle rate. The hurdle rate is when Dan has his engineers and plant managers come up with these ideas, instead of Dan saying, look, you need to have a rate of return above, or internal rate of return on this idea higher than 9%, he's going to add the cushion. He's going to say, you know what, let's make that 10.5% or 11% or 12%, something like that. In that way, there's some cushion in there. So that's called the hurdle rate. So you want to pay off the hurdle rate, or you need to, when Dan Loveland sets the hurdle rate, he looks at his weighted average cost of capital, which is Warren and my required rate of return and the bank's rate of return, and he adds a little cushion on that. And then he just tells his managers, he says, our hurdle rate for the company is 11 or 12%, whatever it is. We're going to provide a lot of cushion in there. Now, um, I'm hopefully for a lot of you, this sparks a bunch of questions because you're going to be like, well, wait a minute. How does risk relate to that? Um, Dan might say, okay, not only are we going to have a hurdle rate of 11%, but we're also going to try to benchmark risk in that product line based on knowledge. And maybe if he says, look, we'll look at a fairly risky product line, um, he's going to increase the hurdle rate to like 20% because he's going to say, if it's not higher than 20%, guys, we don't know if this is going to work. So he may increase the hurdle rate. So that hurdle rate is kind of what the internal managers are looking at uh, when they do these types of investments. I'm going to leave that right there. If you guys want to quick take a picture of that and maybe print it off to write some notes for yourself, I don't care. You do need to understand required rate of return, cost of capital, uh, and which person that is. It's the same thing, but from what perspective are we looking at this? So the cost of capital is the agent. How do we figure out the cost of capital? We usually use the weighted average cost of capital. Some people say the weighted marginal cost of capital. WACC to me is way more fun because it's WACC. You need to know that, and then you need to know the hurdle rate. So the hurdle rate, Dan will plug in, he'll put that cushion in there. He may also put a little more in there for economic value added because they want to make sure that they're getting paid, which is what we talked about here to begin with. Okay. Now I know that sounds like a lot, guys, and I know it's challenging to understand all this terminology. And I know when you took finance, a lot of it felt like number crunching and sometimes this stuff gets lost. But if you're going to go get a business degree, you better understand this information because that's what people that have business degrees should understand and know. All right, let's go back then to again our other document in mergers and acquisitions. Okay. So when Poet is looking at this, Dan Loveland looks at his weighted average cost of capital. He sets a hurdle rate. A lot of times he'll put a little economic value added in there or the cushion because we want to make sure we're making money. He might adopt that or change that based on risk. And now we're going to look at mergers and acquisitions is the exact same thing as the new product line. The process is exactly the same. You do a capital budget, which is just the entire budget of the company you're trying to acquire. Then you look at your value of your company. And as we said at the beginning, you add the two together. If in 3 years after you acquire the company, you look at it and you say, wow, we can go sell our company now for many times what the book value of our parent business is, plus our target company that we bought, our value is bigger than the sum of the parts. So then this was valuable. It was value. But again, 50 to 80% of the time that fails to happen. Okay, so that's from the financial perspective. We're going to go through some other concerns with mergers and acquisitions because, again, go back to the Ansoff matrix in our sustainable competitive advantage and our core competencies. When you acquire another firm, there needs to be a rationale that touches on the core competencies and the sustainable competitive advantage. If the merger doesn't, then investors or the stockholders are probably not going to be real happy. So if General Electric wants to go merge or acquire a company, they're going to want to make sure their treasurer of General Electric is communicating to the investor class saying, here's why we're doing it, here's the justification, how it's going to enhance our sustainable competitive advantage, or it melds well with our core competency. Okay, so here are some theoretical reasons that a company might be targeted for takeover. One is there's a tax benefit. Another might be that there's a key person in that company that has some type of experience, either managerial or technical experience, that would be very valuable to the parent company. Okay, that's two and three. The company is trying to enter into a new region. So think about the Ansoff matrix. Same product, we're just trying to find new people to sell to. The company, the parent firm might have a lot of money they're sitting on in 2017, 18, I think it was, 2015. Somewhere in there, Apple was sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars of cash, and the stockholders were outraged. That's not your money. Tim Cook, pay that back to the investors whose money it actually is, because Tim Cook doesn't own Apple, the stockholders do. So maybe he could say, well, we're going to go buy Samsung because we can buy it with this $100 million that we have sitting here. And then we would have a monopoly and own the world, the smartphones anyway. Another one would be to help the target firm. Maybe the target firm has a really good idea, but they don't have enough working capital to buy additional inventory. So a parent firm could acquire that company, thereby giving them the cash or the working capital needed to expand and grow. And maybe that's all they're waiting for. Now, this is a angry one for me, as you might imagine, to diversify into new product lines. When we say that 50 to 80% of the time mergers and acquisitions fail, if the company's doing it to try to diversify, they're usually going to fail. Okay. It almost guaranteed, but this is a theoretical justification. The merger might help out the capital structure of both firms or one firm. It might create an economy of scale or scope that currently couldn't be possessed. And then the last one is the most important. That'll be a test question. Is there's a synergy. Now, what is synergy? When one company acquires another company, let's say Daktronics goes and they're going to purchase a small electronic specialty company that makes certain parts. Okay. When Daktronics does that, we'll say Daktronics has two payroll specialists, and neither one of them they're only working about 80% of the time. When they go by the target firm, usually what will happen is they will pull out that target firm's payroll specialist. So they don't need three of them. They can do it internally at Daktronics. Their HR people, maybe they don't need them, so they'll get rid of the HR people. So the idea of synergy is the sum of each of these does more together. Okay. So 1 + 1 = more than two. If you've ever worked to build something with somebody, try to do it yourself. It takes 10 hours. You have a friend help you, all of a sudden it takes 3 hours. Um, because when you take the 10 hours, if you have two people, then it would shrink to 5 hours, right? Or should theoretically. But if it only takes 3 hours, then you have a synergy of 2 hours. Okay. You're saving energy um, by the sum of it equals more than the sum of the parts, which is actually the only real theoretical justification for acquiring a company for the most part. You need to know this one, bad reasons why a firm gets acquired, which is very common, diversifying into product lines or different portfolios. The big ones here, though, are management hubris, Companies start buying other companies, and it's sometimes managers will do what's called, or CEOs will do what's called empire building. When a organization gets bigger and bigger, then in theory, the CEO should start getting paid more and more and more because the CEO now has more and more responsibility. So CEOs will go create an empire, and that is not a good reason to get into these other markets. Competitive advantage, core competencies, those are the reasons why you would want to do that. Might also be, these are all very similar. They're related to each other. So management, hubris, or overconfidence. Remember, 50 to 80% of mergers and acquisitions fail. Uh, the leader might be trying to build an empire and then an increase in management composition because of higher profits. Okay, there's three types of mergers and acquisitions. There's called a horizontal merger, a vertical merger, and a conglomerate merger. Um, a horizontal merger, if you imagine, is next to each other. That is when a company buy or targets a competitor, okay, typically. A vertical merger up and down is when a party in the supply chain usually purchases somebody either downstream or upstream of whatever it is they're doing. A conglomerate merger is, which is very common with like conglomerates like Johnson and Johnson, General Electric, Sony, Disney. They all have holdings in what might be thought to be diversified businesses or manufacturing and things like that. They're typically a little more successful doing that because their specialty is coming in and running companies. General Electric used to say their synergy that they brought to the table was their knowledge and ability to acquire other businesses because it turned into a core competency of theirs. They got so good at it. So conglomerates usually own more businesses in different, either vertically or horizontally in different environments. Okay, you need to know the only theoretical reason to merge or acquire a firm is when the value together of the acquiring firm, the target firm, and the synergistic benefits, that's what this is more or greater than the sum of the parts. Okay. So right away, synergy should be the biggest reason what drives a merger acquisition. Um, I'll try to tell a story later about watching a company that had been acquired by a publicly traded company, and all of a sudden they started hiring different employees and different pieces to the company, which is unheard of. That doesn't happen. Usually they're firing those extra payroll specialists and HR managers that they don't need anymore. So this just gets into the how we calculate whether or not it is worthwhile to move forward with a merger acquisition and some of the information there. Um, in that process, we also do a stock valuation if it's we're acquiring or a valuation of the firm. And once you do that, it sets in the negotiation terminology what's called an MPO and an LAO. An MPO is the most preferred outcome, so that would be well, as little as humanly possible. The least acceptable outcome would be the value of the acquired firm plus the synergistic benefits. Okay. So that's the least acceptable outcome is the most you'd be willing to pay for the firm. When you're in negotiations, the target firm also, you need to do evaluation and you want to start looking from their perspective them wanting to be acquired. What's their most preferred outcome? What's their least acceptable outcome? Typically, the negotiation will sort of land here in the middle. Typically, not always. Financing mergers and acquisitions. There are as many ways to do that as humanly possible. It's the same as buying a business or buying a small business. You can do stock ownership. You can do pay flat out in cash, go to the bank, borrow money. Many, many ways to do this. Um, and I'm not going to test you on that. There's also what's called hostile and friendly mergers and acquisitions or takeovers. A hostile takeover, so let's say Yahoo and Facebook, we'll pretend Facebook's not 90,000 times bigger than Yahoo because back when I wrote this, they weren't. So if Yahoo's a publicly traded company and Facebook is just a new kind of startup that's only worth $50 million, Yahoo may want to target Zuckerberg and Facebook to acquire them. If Mark doesn't want to be bought out by Yahoo, though, well, then it would be called a hostile takeover. Because what Yahoo can do is they can start purchasing shares, publicly traded shares of Facebook until it owns enough shares to get a member that they want on the board of directors of Facebook. Then they keep buying stock and trying to take over the company. So they call that a hostile takeover. There's a couple strategies that can be played out when, for Mark Zuckerberg, if that happens. One of them is called a white knight strategy. Maybe Zuckerberg doesn't want to be acquired by Yahoo, but he defined being acquired by Apple. So if Yahoo is trying to purchase shares and go after Facebook, Zuckerberg could call Tim Cook and say, hey, look, I don't want to work for Yahoo, but I'm fine working for you. Would you come in and buy out the company and prevent that from happening? If he does, great. Then you have what's called a gray knight or a black knight strategy. A gray knight or a black knight might be Zuckerberg does not want to get acquired by Yahoo. His preference would be Apple, but Apple said no. Well, then there's Google. So maybe Google could come in. Now, Mark probably doesn't want to be owned by Google. Okay. In fact, maybe he really doesn't want to. But if he had to choose between Google and Yahoo, his preference would be to be owned by Google. Now, what can happen, or one of the reasons why he might do that is he can create a bidding war between Yahoo and Google, which causes the stock price of Facebook to go up to a point where now the valuation is way too much and it's not worthwhile. Uh, because the stock price is so high, there's adding up the acquired firm with the target or the parent firm, it makes the valuation not make sense anymore. It's not financially doable or worthwhile. So then Yahoo can't sell the idea to their stockholders. Real quick, when a business sells off, I think I talked about this in one of the other videos, not uncommon for a company instead of just letting a product line go by the wayside, if they still have customers and there's still value in it, to divest that business and sell it either to somebody else or to try to get the employees in that department to buy it outright and have some sort of partnership to buy that business line. Then we also have something called a reverse merger. A reverse merger is not the splitting of something. It's when a company, let's say, what would be a good one? Let's say Nick's Hamburgers wants to grow. They'll say they have five other franchise, but they want to get a lot more money to start, really expanding and taking over the world. Nick's Hamburgers could buy a publicly traded company, okay, or a publicly traded restaurant company franchise. And then once they're in and they've bought in that publicly traded firm, now they can put out additional offerings and it's a little cheaper. So what they're trying to do, a reverse merger is you're trying to get into a publicly traded position when you're not currently publicly traded. A lot less scrutiny, so on and so forth. Okay, everything we've talked about in this master strategy and tools, you may want to watch these videos twice. You may want to read through it after I've gone through it with you. You need to know this stuff because the rest of your strategy is going to have almost everything to do with this stuff. The questions I will ask are going to be based on the Ansoff matrix, core competencies, sustainable competitive advantages, mergers, acquisitions, hurdle rates, WACC, weighted average cost of capital, required rates of return. All of that is the terminology that we will be using when you start going out and trying to apply strategy. Let's stop there. If you have questions, feel free to contact me, email me. I know that's a lot. Possibly before emailing me or calling me, you may just want to watch these videos again. On the next video, so yep, we're going to have part 5. I will go through the rest of the PowerPoint in chapter 2. I hope you have a good rest of your day. And again, this is for summer 2025. Have a good rest of your